Isaac Newton. Yes, that Isaac Newton. The man who discovered gravity and calculated the motion of the planets. In 1720, he lost roughly £3 million in today's money, in a single stock. 8 months earlier, he had walked away from the same stock with £7,000 in profit. He won. He acknowledged he had won. Then, he went back in and gave it all back. Today's story is the South Sea Bubble, the biggest speculative wave of the 18th century, and possibly modern finance's most expensive lesson. Because if Isaac Newton couldn't win this game, what chance does the rest of us have? Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. In 1720, Isaac Newton was 77 years old. He was president of the Royal Society. He was master of the Royal Mint. So he was not just a scientist. He was the man sitting at the head of England's monetary system. How money works, where the value of money comes from. These were professional questions he had to know. The South Sea Company had been founded in 1711. The company's job was simple. It would take on the English government's debt. In exchange, it would receive a monopoly on trading with Spain's colonies in South America. Officially. In practice, the Spanish almost never permitted that trade. For years, the company did almost no actual business. But by 1720, the company's management made a new offer. They would take on the rest of the English government's debt. In exchange, Parliament would grant them new privileges. The plan was approved, and the price began to explode. In January 1720, South Sea stock was around £128. In February, it was £175. By the end of March, it touched £380. This is where Newton enters. Sometime in February or March, Newton bought South Sea stock. The exact date is not in the records, but here is what we know. On April 21st, 1720, he sold his position. He had made £7,000 in profit, roughly £1 million in today's money. The scientist had done the right thing. He had won, he had cashed out, and he had sat down. There was a problem. On the day Newton sold, the stock was around £400. 3 months later, it was at £1,050. Newton had made money, but everyone around him was making far more. His neighbor was getting rich. His colleagues at the Royal Society were getting rich. His contacts at court were getting rich, and Newton couldn't bear it. In June, with the stock already past £700, Newton bought back in, this time with a much larger position. Then the stock hit 900. Newton bought more. In early July, the stock reached its all-time peak of £1,050. Newton was still buying. It is worth pausing on this. Newton was not stupid. Newton was one of the most intelligent human beings who ever lived, a man whose mathematics shaped meaning across centuries. What he did was not from ignorance. It was not from cowardice either. The opposite. He did it from the fear of being the only one left out while everyone else was winning. Today, we call it FOMO. 300 years ago, they just called it foolishness. But this was Isaac Newton's foolishness, which is to say, it wasn't foolishness. September 1720. The cracks began to show. Some of the founding shareholders were quietly leaving. Rumors were spreading that the company actually did no real business. By the end of November, the stock had fallen below £200. By January 1721, it was at 124. It had returned to where it had started. Newton's total loss was about £20,000, roughly $3 million in today's money. In the money of that time, enough to buy a small country estate. He had lost more than 3 times what he made 8 months earlier. This is the moment the story's most famous line arrives. It is said to have been spoken by Newton to those closest to him. Whether he actually said it is still debated by historians. But the line he is believed to have said is this: "I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of men." To understand the lesson underneath the story, you have to see something structural. The South Sea bubble was not a fraud. It was not a Ponzi scheme. It was not an imaginary company. It was a real company. It had official privileges. Parliament had approved it. There was just one small problem. The company could not do the trade it had promised. It was impossible. But the stock price was not determined by the company's actual value. It was determined by what people believed the stock was worth. This is finance's thousand-year-old problem. What happens when price separates from value? How long can they stay apart? Newton's £20,000 did not go to waste, because his loss became the beginning of a 300-year lesson. Stock prices do not stick to fundamentals. They stick to people, and people always behave the same way. How does this show up in the modern world? The first is the dot-com bubble. In 1999 and 2000, it was Newton's era on repeat. Internet companies with no business model rose 50-fold simply because their name had .com in it. Even the smartest investors couldn't stay out. Stanley Druckenmiller, one of the most successful hedge fund managers in the world, bought tech stocks at the very top in the spring of 2000. He lost $3 billion. He said afterwards, "I bought too late and I knew it, but I couldn't stand it." The second is the 2021 space craze. A building, a ledger, a lawyer. That was enough for a spake. Billions of dollars flowed into these empty shell companies. Within 3 years, most of them lost over 90% of their value. The third is crypto. What can be said exactly about Newton's South Sea stock can also be said about certain crypto coins today. The company is real. The management is real. There is just one small problem. It does not do what it says it does. Newton had to learn this 300 years ago. We are still learning the same lesson. In the next episode, the story begins in the same year as Newton, the same continent, within a few months, in fact. His name is John Law. His title is Finance Minister of France. The bubble he created was larger than the South Sea. The crash was sharper, the aftermath more tragic. The Mississippi bubble. Subscribe. See you there.